All
You can
right,
go.
so let's go ahead and get us started. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you all to the webinar titled Incoterms, the world's essential terms of trade, starring everyone's favorite international business attorney, Graham Catlett. My name is Jonathan Bricker, and I'm the chair of the Arkansas District Export Council. In my primary role, I work for Regions Bank located in Bentonville, Arkansas. My banking career started off as international business development, and now I'm a commercial lender with a focus on helping commercial and industrial businesses located throughout Arkansas. I want to begin today by thanking our sponsors. This webinar and all the webinars throughout the year would not be possible without our partnership with the Arkansas Economic Development Commission, as well as Arkansas Manufacturing Solutions. So thank you both organizations for all your help throughout the year. I really appreciate you all joining us today. For those of you that aren't quite sure who the deck is and what we do, allow me to do just a quick introduction. We're a private, nonprofit organization that brings together experienced international business people with potential exporters. Each deck member has been appointed by the U.S. Secretary of Commerce for their real world expertise in international trade. We have a ton of experience throughout our council in many different sectors. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean we know all the answers, but we can introduce you to someone who does. We are basically a community of connections within the exporting world. My hope for the day is that you walk away with this webinar with more confidence in your exporting abilities. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar and you don't really feel comfortable asking it here, I invite you to reach out on our website at exportarkansas.org, and we'll have one of our members reach out to you. There, you can also sign up for our monthly newsletter, which is just chock full of pertinent international news and trade show opportunities. And I'll tell you what, right now it is hard keeping a newsletter accurate with everything that's going on in this world. But we're doing the best that we can. The class today is designed to generate questions as you work through what it takes to successfully send your product or service overseas. It's meant to be a high level overview of some very important parts of exporting. Then, as you're ready to take the next step, the DEX council members will be here to help in any way possible. Basically, we want to be your strategic partner to help you grow your exports and help grow your bottom line. If you guys have any questions or comments or anything, please feel free to raise your hand or put your question in the chat, and they'll be sure to get to your questions. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce everyone to your moderator this afternoon, Mr. Rudy Ortiz. He is the owner of Strategic Business Services LLC, where he helps companies in a wide variety of international business and exporting needs. He works alongside companies entering into new markets and is a U.S. partner of Global Market Entry Consultants, which is a global entry export experts throughout 32 countries. He has an MBA in international business, and he facilitates export and supply chain related classes for the deck. And he's also a certified business global professional. So for these reasons, he's the DEX education chair. Thank you, Rudy, for all your hard work on getting everything set up. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate that. And actually, we now are in 34 countries.
Oh, nice.
We added partners in the last month or so in Peru and in Chile, and so we're currently actually in 34 countries. But thank you for that. And so today's webinar is going to be great. You know, I always love doing this webinar with Graham. He is been with the deck either as a chair or as a member now for many, many years. And not only is he an international attorney, he has real world experience in exporting. He did some marvelous things in terms of exporting, or maybe I should say importing food products to Russia for several years, and he continues to do exporting into other countries. So not only does he have the professional legal expertise in the international field, but he also has real world exporting expertise. I think you might see there. He's been doing this for a very, very long time, and he is, very selective in the clients that he takes on to help them both domestically and internationally. And for this reason, we have Graham to be our key speaker on Incoterms. And so, with that, Graham, let's take it away.
Thank you, Rudy. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody, and I hope this will be an informal discussion of Incoterms. Please don't hesitate to raise your hand, and if I don't see it, maybe Heidi can alert me and interrupt me so that we can really speak to the things that you're most interested in. Let me also apologize for my appearance. I want to be able to say that it came from a bar fight last night. It might help my reputation, but I'm afraid the truth is a little more pedestrian. Uh, but uh, but I know that it doesn't look very good, and I apologize.
You look great, man.
Today we're going to talk about the Incoterms, which is a system of uh, uh, terms that are used in international trade and developed by the International Chamber of Commerce. And let me begin by recommending to everybody that they buy this book, which is published by the International Chamber of Commerce, and it has the details of what Incoterms really mean and the obligations of the parties. Most of us probably are familiar with the designation of the various Incoterms, but I hope today we'll be able to explain to you that there is a lot more depth that goes into these terms than what we just know from the three-letter designation. The topics that I want to talk about today are these on the screen. First, what do they do and what do they not do? Second, what happens if the Incoterms are not properly incorporated into the agreement? Third, what does it mean by place? Fourth, what are the obligations that you are incurring both as a buyer and a seller when you use Incoterms? Because as I say, it's not just a three-letter designation. Then which Incoterms should you use? What kinds of insurance does it mean when Incoterms requires insurance? We'll talk a little bit more about ocean-going shipments and then consider a couple of cases that put into practical effect what these terms mean. The first thing that I want to talk about is what do Incoterms do and what do they not do? And as far as what do they do, it's principally three things. First, it establishes a list of obligations between the buyer and the seller. It's not just those three letters, but those incorporate a host of obligations that I'll go through a little bit more because those are the things that we often don't know about. The second thing it does is it determines when risk shifts between the seller to the buyer. And the answer is upon delivery. So we'll talk about what does delivery really mean. The third thing that the rules do is that they establish which party pays certain costs. As far as what they don't do, it may be more also than what you expect. First of all, these terms do not create a contract of sale. They can be incorporated into your contract of sale, but On their own, they do not constitute a contract of sale. Secondly, they do not establish the time, place, method, or currency of payment. That's outside the scope of these Incoterms. They also do not determine remedies for breach of a contract. They don't determine the instances that would be force majeure. And finally, they do not resolve disputes or set out the method, law, or venue of the dispute resolution. Now, what happens if the term is misstated? Well, let's look at how it should properly be stated. To properly incorporate an Incoterm and all the related obligations into your agreement, you say, and you see where I've got quotes, whatever the term is, then specify a port, place, or point, and then end the phrase with Incoterms, the registered sign 2020. For example, a proper way to incorporate Incoterms would be CIF Shanghai Incoterms 2020, or DAP, a street address, Conway, Arkansas, USA, Incoterms 2020. And you see I've referred in 3 of these instances here to Incoterms 2020. And that's because Incoterms are revised every 10 years. And it is important to put the year that you're talking about because the 2010 Incoterms were slightly different from 2020. But let's compare what I just went over with some designations that you may have seen. FOB Fayetteville, Arkansas. Now you see that has a couple of differences with Incoterms. First of all, FOB is a waterway term, and there's not much navigable waters not in Fayetteville. Also, it does not state Incoterms 2020. And to compare that one with FOB New Orleans Incoterms 2020. Now, let me say another thing about this first FOB Fayetteville, Arkansas. Although we are talking today about Incoterms, there are other trade terms which you may see. For instance, the Uniform Commercial Code has a series of a few delivery terms, including something like FOB Fayetteville, Arkansas, which may have different meanings from Incoterms, but it may be a legally enforceable term because it's in the Uniform Commercial Code. But today, let's just talk about Incoterms because we'll have plenty on our plate. As far as including the proper language in your Incoterms, it is not necessary to use the R, and it is necessary to use the year because, as I said, Incoterms are revised every 10 years. Now, the next common problem is what place are we talking about? And the place is going to be specified in your designation of Incoterms, but here's how it works. In all the rules, except the C rules, the place indicates where the goods are delivered. In the D rules, the place is both delivery and destination. In the C rules, the place is destination, but not delivery. If that sounds complicated, I think we'll help answer some of that a little bit more. But you see, place is an important element of Incoterms. Now, why is it important? Well, when you determine the point of delivery, that is the place where the risk of loss shifts from the seller to the buyer. So it becomes very important to identify where the seller's risk ends and the buyer's risk begins. The extremes are these two. The closest to the seller is Ex Works, and the closest to the buyer is DDP. Now, why is that important? Well, if the seller wants to take the least risk possible, then the Incoterm that the seller would want is Ex Works, because delivery occurs at the seller's dock. If the buyer wants the seller to assume risk for as long as possible, then the risk will shift to the buyer closest to the buyer by using the DDP term. So we think, well, why don't we always do that? And the reason is because our customer or our seller may not allow it. And so it has to be negotiated as to where that risk of loss will actually shift. There's some other elements to place. And I think it would make sense to you is if we say the place of delivery is Shanghai, or even the port at Shanghai, that's not necessarily a precise point. And so if you can identify a precise point, if you do not describe a precise point, then, as we'll see, the Incoterms will supply that point for you at which the risk and the delivery occur. Now, sometimes there may be multiple carriers involved. And so the question becomes, where does delivery occur when there are multiple carriers? And that really depends on which Incoterm you're using and the situation. But for instance, under CIP, the delivery will occur when the seller delivers the goods to the first carrier. So even though there may be multiple carriers, the delivery and the risk of loss will shift when it's delivered to the first carrier. Now, because this can be confusing between the buyer and seller, it's probably a better practice to make it clear in your contract where that risk of loss is going to shift. Another problem that I've alluded to is, what are the obligations that you are incurring by using these Incoterms? Because just because you do something simple like incorporating CIF into your contract, what does that really mean? Well, that's why you need this book, because for each of the Incoterms, there are pages that describe both the seller's obligations and the buyer's obligations, and they go far beyond what we customarily think of as the risk of loss shifting under the three-letter term. So let me try to say it another way. We often think of Incoterms as simply a risk-sharing provision, but it's not. It has substantive obligations for both the buyer and the seller. These are the categories that are on your screen, but the details of what those obligations are are contained in the book that's published by the International Chamber of Commerce. So now let's go to the next topic, and that's which Incoterm should we use? Well, there are two categories of Incoterms. First, there are these terms which can be used for any mode or modes of transport. And then there will be four others that are only to be used for sea and inland waterway transport. Now, let me go back. You'll probably be familiar with many of these. As we mentioned earlier, the ex works rule is the one where the risk of loss shifts from the seller to the buyer at the seller's dock. So the seller incurs the least amount of risk and the buyer the most amount of risk. But there are others. There's free carrier, CPT, CIP, DAP, DPU, and DDP. For ocean and inland waterway transport, there are four others: FAS for free alongside ship, free on board, cost and freight, and CIF. Let me show you a neat thing that this book has, and it's in the form of a graphic that helps us people like me, simple people, try to understand better what I just went through about the shifting of the costs and the risks. Let's take this first graphic here. You see the blue generally means the seller, and the yellow means the buyer. You'll see the truck, which in this case is yellow, and the cargo, which is sitting in the truck. Underneath that line, there are two lines, one called costs and one called risks. So the way this diagram works is that for the category, for the Incoterm FCA, the costs shift from the seller to the buyer once the cargo is loaded into the buyer's truck. You see? And then the costs shift from the seller to the buyer, and the buyer has costs all the way until it reaches the buyer's destination. Risks are similar. The seller has the risk of the goods until the goods are loaded onto the buyer's truck, at which point the buyer will have risks until it reaches the buyer's destination. Another fact situation for FCA is if there is an intermediate stop. So look at this graphic. In this case, the seller is delivering the goods to an intermediate point, and the costs and risk of loss will shift from the seller to the buyer, not at the buyer's destination, but at an intermediate point while the goods are still on the seller's truck. And at that point, the risk of loss and the costs shift to the buyer. Let me take another one. This is CIP, and we're adding the element of insurance here. So in CIP, you see the costs of the seller continue all the way until the goods reach the buyer's destination and remain in the truck. From the point that they reach the destination but are still unloaded, the buyer begins to assume the costs. Risks are totally different. The seller maintains the risk only until the goods are loaded in the truck, at which point the buyer will assume the risks until they reach the buyer's destination. One other aspect to it, and that's insurance. You see, this insurance has to be provided, and it's in blue, so it is the seller's cost. Insurance will be provided by the buyer, by the seller, until it reaches this point of delivery, which is the goods reach the buyer's destination, but they are still unloaded in the truck.
Graham, if I might jump in here for just a second for
Please.
some maybe additional clarification. When we talk about the transfer risk, we're talking about the transfer of liability. In essence, if there is a loss, who is liable at that point, whatever that point may be, for the loss?
That's exactly right. It's exactly right, Rudy. And it may be a little bit clearer when I do the next slide, because the next slide seemingly has the same financial terms, but the risk is a little different. This is the difference between DAP and CIP. In DAP, you see the seller has the risk of loss, again, until the goods reach the buyer's destination and are unloaded, both the costs and the risks. But under CIP, the seller has the costs, in other words, pays for the transportation, until the goods reach the buyer's destination unloaded. But the risk transfers way back at the time when the goods are loaded onto the truck. And the buyer has that risk of loss from that point forward. Now, in this CIP, you see that the seller is providing insurance all the way to the end. So you might ask, well, what's the big deal? Is there really any difference between DAP and CIP? Because the seller in DAP must assume the costs of transportation and the risk of loss until it reaches the buyer's destination. Here, the seller is paying the costs of transportation to the buyer's destination, but he's also providing insurance. Well, there is a difference. And the difference is if something happens to the cargo during transportation, who has to claim against the insurance policy? In DAP, the responsibility is the seller to get the goods to the buyer's destination. But in CIP, the seller risk of loss ends at the seller's point of loading. And so, although the seller provided the buyer insurance, the buyer has to fight with the insurance company to collect the proceeds. And if you've had any experience with insurance, there is a difference. Now, in this one, CPT, the delivery and destination are in different places. You see the costs of transportation are borne by the seller until it reaches the buyer's location. But the risk of loss shifts before the truck leaves the seller's location. So we have a difference in destination and delivery. Remember, we defined delivery earlier as the point where risk of loss shifts. So for CPT, risk of loss is going to shift here. Now, I hope you are as confused as I was when I first started studying this, because it's not as simple as one might think. And in negotiating a transaction, there are certainly advantages to the seller and advantages to the buyer of using different Incoterms.
Yeah, you can really slice it and dice it a dozen different ways. And I think that's really the key understanding here is that, as you stated, Graham, it is not as simple as one might think. There are several different ways that this can be done, each carrying different risk.
Right? And what the situation we do not want to find ourselves in is that we're surprised, and we don't want to uh, realize that we didn't understand all this before a loss occurs. Now, the next topic, we've been talking about insurance, is what kind of insurance is required. I think everybody knows that there are basically two general types. One is where an insurance company will insure against specified perils, and the other is where the insurance company will cover all risk. Well, as you might expect, under different Incoterms, different kinds of insurance is required to be provided by the seller. Under CIF, which is generally ocean-going freight, the seller is only required to provide the buyer with specified peril insurance, where now under CIP, the seller must provide all risk insurance. So the costs to the seller are higher in CIP because they're providing a broader policy coverage. Now, anything can be negotiated and changed, but there is this difference in the insurance. As far as ocean going, I'll show you some more graphics that are kind of cool to look at. One of the terms is FAS, and you see here that the seller is responsible for costs up to the dock, and the risks and the costs shift to the buyer at the dock before the goods are loaded onto the ship. Under FOB, slightly different, the seller is responsible for the costs and the risks until the goods are loaded onto the ship. Then the risk of loss and the cost of transportation shift. Third, CNF or CFR. Here, the costs of transportation are paid for by the seller until it reaches the buyer's dock, and the risk of loss shifts not during the transport, but the risk shifts when the goods are loaded onto the ship. And finally, CIF, the seller is responsible for the costs of transportation. The risks shift upon loading, but the seller must provide insurance until it reaches the buyer's dock. And we discussed what kind of insurance is it, and its specified peril. Okay, since y'all know all there is about Incoterms, let me now give you a case study and see if this follows along with what we learned. This is a lawsuit that was decided in United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. And it involved the sale of a MRI machine. The manufacturer was in Germany, and the buyer was in Calumet, Illinois. And they had a one-page contract, not unusual, and it provided that the MRI system, and look at this language, will be delivered to Calumet, Illinois fully functional. It also said CIF New York Seaport. And finally, the contract said the system remains the property of the seller until complete payment has been received after delivery to Illinois and inspection. So as you might expect, the MRI was loaded on the ship in good condition, but it was busted when it arrived in Calumet, Illinois, and they don't know when the damage occurred. So the legal question for us is, where did the risk of loss shift? Well, first question is, which law applies to this? And the court held that German law controls because it was stated in the contract that German law applied. But what in the world is German law? Well, German law says that if both parties to a sale of international goods are in countries which have signed the United Nations Convention on Contracts, then the law will be the United Nations Convention on Contracts. Few of us probably ever heard of that. But that is the law that is going to govern this transaction. Now, what does that say? Does that have an Incoterm in it? And was the Incoterm properly incorporated into the contract? Well, let's go back and look. It said CIF New York Seaport. It didn't say, Incoterms 2020 or 2000, it would be at that time. And so, do Incoterms apply to this contract? Well, under this treaty, this United Nations Convention on Contracts for the Sale of Goods, it says, and let me quote, the parties are considered, unless otherwise agreed, to have impliedly made applicable to their contract a usage of which the parties knew or ought to have known, and which in international trade is widely known and regularly observed by parties to contracts of this type. It doesn't say that Incoterms is automatically incorporated into each contract. It's actually broader than that. It says in every trade contract between parties who reside in these countries and which this convention and treaty applies, then any common usage is going to be imposed on the contract. And the court held that Incoterms was a common usage, and therefore Incoterms would apply even though they didn't properly list it. How about that? Next fact. Remember, we said that this contract says the system remains the property of the seller until complete payment has been received after delivery to Illinois and inspection. So what does that have to do with it? Well, as I said at the very beginning, the fact that title did not transfer until payment was not important, because Incoterms and risk of loss are separate from the passage of title. So even though title didn't pass until the broken machine arrived in Illinois, risk of loss transferred earlier. And where would it have been? It would have been when the ship was loaded in Germany. So who wins? The seller wins, because the risk of loss shifted at the time the seller loaded that ship with the cargo, and anything that happened after that point is the buyer's responsibility. But wait, it's not really the buyer, it's the buyer's insurance company, because insurance was provided. So that's where the proper use of an Incoterm and the proper incorporation of it into a contract and the proper contract become important. But there's one final point to confuse you even more, and that is a decision of the United States Court of International Trade on a customs issue. And what this opinion said is that even though we will look at customs, we will look at Incoterms, that doesn't totally determine the freight deduction inquiry for customs purposes. It says that we'll look at the whole transaction for customs purposes, not just to the Incoterms on a shipping document. So my final suggestion is buy the book, but I'm happy to take some easy questions either now or later. You're always welcome to email me, and I'm happy to provide, if I can, the answers later in the week at no cost, of course.
Yeah.
But I hope this broadened your understanding of Incoterms and also persuaded you to buy the book, even though I don't get a commission on it.
Well, and this is the reason that we have Graham providing this information. As you can see, there are lots of pitfalls if you make any sort of assumptions with these Incoterms, or if you think that it's you know X works is always best or DDP is always best. It just absolutely depends, and so you have to be very, very careful in terms of really understanding each one of these rules, and which is the one that you guys have actually negotiated. So let me see here. Miss Heidi, do we currently have any questions?
Yes, you have two questions in the
I see them
Q&A.
now. Right.
And
Yeah,
have
the
two a question in the chat too. Several
okay.
questions in the chat.
I
Okay.
see one is the name of the book. This is Incoterms 2020, published by the International Chamber of Commerce. You may be able to get it on Amazon too, but I know you can search for the International Chamber of Commerce website and order it from them.
Yeah, one of the first questions is Mohammed is asking, how do I determine which Incoterm I need to negotiate? Well, obviously it depends on all the different particulars, right? I mean, what is the mode of transportation? What is your appetite for risk? There's just a number of things.
Well, and let me even simplify it. If you're the seller, start with X works. The buyer negotiate from there. If you're the buyer, start with DDP and make the seller negotiate you down from there. But those are the extremes that provide the buyer and the seller with the most protection.
Right. And the other way to look at it as well is, let's just say that all your competition, they're only going to do X works, and they just won't even consider anything but X works or DDP on the opposite side. Well, you can have some negotiating ability, and you can make yourself a little bit more attractive by being more flexible in terms of what the terms are, but recognizing that your pricing, hopefully, it should reflect the increase in risk that you're taking on as a consequence of not going either DDP, on one side and X works on the other. The next question it looks more like a comment. Says we have a very well-known customer who's requesting we, the manufacturer supplier, change from FCA to DDP. I wonder why, in which they took it upon themselves to redefine DDP into MDDP, with further breakdown to MPP, modified port pickup, and MFP, modified factory pickup. Yet they still want ownership to function as FCA Incoterms. Can you please advise on the situation?
Well, and I think there's another question that's going to ask this. Any of this can be modified in your contract of sale. But if it's not modified, then by using an Incoterm, you're going to incorporate the body of law and all the rules into your contract. And so if you try to vary one of these Incoterms, it may become meaningless by adding an M in front of it, for instance, unless you define what that term means. There's nothing wrong with defining it, because then in effect you're modifying the term. But if you don't define it, then you've got a problem, because what's a court going to say it means?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Now there's another question here. Kimberly is asking, what supersedes a contract or a PO if there is conflicting information?
Well, there are a couple of answers to that. First of all, if it's a difference between a contract and an Incoterm, then the contract can modify the Incoterm. Now, as far as a contract and a PO, it gets a little bit more complicated, because it depends on which law is going to govern the transaction. For instance, a transaction in the United States, it can very well be the last communication between a buyer and a seller will govern it, unless the other side objects. But in an international transaction governed by this UN treaty, then the answer may be different. So you need to know what kind of a transaction it is before I can tell you, which will control. It's not always the same.
Absolutely. One of the things that I always like to bring up is something that happened. I guess it's probably been 3 years now. The Ever Given, a ship that was going through the Suez Canal and got stuck. So imagine that your goods are in a container, and all of a sudden you're stuck in the Suez Canal for a month. The number of things that could go wrong, is just tremendous, and the cost, the additional cost and loss and whatnot. That's why these things need to be really specified, and that you really need to understand worst case scenario. I mean, to consider worst case scenario, and to agree to those terms, that if the worst case scenario did happen, would you be protected, and how would you be protected?
And really, you've made a good point. And let me mention that Incoterms will not answer the question that you posed. And that is why you need to have a sales contract that will define more of the terms of the agreement. Because as we started out saying, one of the things Incoterms does not do is discuss force majeure. What happens if it goes wrong, or delays and penalties and default. So that's why it's necessary to come to another one of our deck conferences on sales contract.
Absolutely. Another wonderful webinar that you put on, Graham, and thank you so much for that. Heidi, I don't think at this point we have any questions in terms of the chat or the question, but if someone does have
There's
a
a few more.
question, what's
There's a
that?
few more. There's one more. Are, are, are the 4 ocean Incoterms you mentioned the only ocean ones that should be used? can X Works be used for ocean?
Let me go back to the list of those. And remember, the first 7 that I gave you are rules for any mode of transport. So they can be used on ocean transport also. The last 4 can only be used on ocean transport. But yes, you could use X-Works or FCA even if you're shipping by ocean.
And the last one is, what was the type of insurance for CIF?
CIF is specified peril insurance, and CIP is all risk insurance. And actually, that changed with these 2020 Incoterms. In the past, it was only specified peril.
Yeah, and I would suspect that the all peril is significantly more expensive because it encompasses like anything and everything.
Well, uh, if you've dealt with insurance companies, you know all risk doesn't mean all risk.
Yeah, that's a
Still got
fact.
some exclusions.
Yeah, yeah. We weren't talking about that.
Yeah, but it's called all risk.
Well, very good. Well, unless someone has any other questions, Heidi, yeah, thank you so much for doing that. So, as it turns out, the national deck, the National Association of District Export Councils, is going to be putting on this great webinar on February the 13th for those of you who are interested in potential opportunities in Africa. And as you guys probably know, there's a lot of stuff going on in Africa right now. So that might be a really good one for you all to attend if you have such an interest. Is there I was thinking there was our next webinar, Miss Heidi. Do you have any
Uh,
information on that?
yes, just one. The next webinar will be the 12 documents webinar.
Right.
Yes, and I will send out that link in the follow-up email for sure. Um, let's see here. I got on the wrong thing here. We need to get back to our.
You know, one of the things that we really strive to do in terms of putting on these webinar trainings is, you know, the concept of, you know, you don't know what you don't know. And, you know, once we expose you to some of these concepts, some of these things that could go wrong and that you need to consider, then, you know, you can tap into the deck and to guys like Graham to nail down the specifics. But first, you have to know that it's a thing, that it's something that you should be considering. And so we put on these webinars and have a wide variety of topics to expose you to some of these concepts, and also to the presenters that have expertise in those areas. Ms. Heidi, did you finally? There you
There
go.
we,
You want
there
do
we
you
are.
want to talk about that, Miss Heidi?
Oh, sure. Yes. Tom Cook is a deck member in New York, and he has his own company, Blue Tiger International. He has graciously consented to present this about the tariffs, the Trump tariffs. It's going to be like a coffee chat, 8:30 in the morning on February 18th. That's next Tuesday morning. So this is open to everyone. It will be a meeting format instead of a webinar format. So come join us. There will be time for Q&A. And he's a great speaker and a good, strong expert on all these things.
Yeah, Tom's been with the deck for a real long time, like Graham has, and has a lot of expertise. And hopefully, hopefully by the 18th, we will have received some additional clarity on the tariffs, because at this point, it seems to be shifting from one day to the next as to, what's actually being executed. So hopefully he'll have some additional clarity to provide to us on that. So, folks, Graham, thank you so much again for presenting this topic in a masterful level. And I hope that everyone has gained some additional information, and at the very least, cause you to ask yourself, do I really understand that? And if you don't, reach out to Graham, and he'll be able to give you some additional insight. Or if you have some other questions that are not necessarily related to the Incoterms, then you can contact me or Jonathan or Heidi, and we will try to get you whatever resource will best suit whatever question or need you might have.
Great.
And with that, I think we will call it a webinar. Thank you so much for that. In order for us to know whether we're doing a good job and how we might be able to do a better job, we put out these surveys. And so if you would take just a minute to answer the survey, would really appreciate it.
Mm.
All righty. I think that's where well, it's still moving a little bit, but
Yeah.
looks like in general people found the webinar valuable. So that's great, and we're very glad that you did. And once again, if you have any additional questions or insights or anything that you want to cover with us, please feel free to contact us. And my email is there as well, and we'll get you whatever information you need. Ms. Heidi, anything else?
I believe that's all.
All righty. Now, our next webinar is on what date?
Well, the actual next webinar will be in March. I believe it's March 12th.
That is correct. Yeah, and it's the 12 documents, which is a extremely handy webinar to attend to try to get some clearer knowledge on filling out documents, and why you fill them out, or how you fill them out, and some of the things that can go wrong if you don't fill them out correctly. So please feel free to attend the that one on the 12th of March at 2 o'clock Central Time. And with that, I think we'll close it out.
Yes. Okay, great.
Uh,
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.